On April 12, 1453, the largest cannon ever cast cracked down its barrel and tore itself apart on its first sustained barrage, and the fall of Constantinople never came. The great bronze bombard built by Orban, the Hungarian founder, who had first offered his guns to the Byzantines and then sold his skill to the Sultan when the emperor could not pay, had been the one weapon capable of doing what no army had done in 1,000 years, opening the Theodosian Walls. Those walls were a triple line fronted by a moat, and they had turned back every attacker since their raising. Gunpowder was the first technology that could threaten them. Now the technology lay shattered in the mud before the Lycus Valley. Mehmed II was 21 years old, and he had staked his prestige on this siege. He had built the Rumeli Hisari fortress on the Bosphorus the year before, choked the city's supply line, and opened his attack on April 6th. He had perhaps 100,000 men against fewer than 8,000 defenders, but the monster gun could be loaded only a handful of times a day, and it overheated badly between shots. When it burst, the bombardment fell to the lighter pieces. They scarred the masonry, they could not break it. And every night, under Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese captain trusted by the whole garrison, the defenders filled the gaps with earth, timber, and barrels before dawn. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Because what no one in either camp yet understood was that a single failed casting had just begun to bend the course of the next 5 centuries. The walls held, and the calendar became Mehmed's enemy. Ottoman field armies had always thinned and dissolved once the campaigning season turned, and every commander in the camp knew it. The lighter guns chewed at the stone and accomplished nothing decisive. The Golden Horn had been forced ships, dragged overland past the Great Chain in late April, yet a fleet in the harbor was not a breach in the wall. And from the northwest came the rumor that mattered most. John Hunyadi, regent captain of Hungary, the most credible Christian sword in the region, was gathering men, and a Venetian squadron was said to be at sea. Into this hesitation stepped Shandali Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier, who had counseled caution from the start. His argument was no longer the voice of timidity, it was arithmetic. A young sultan who threw his army against an unbroken wall and failed could lose far more than a city. He could lose his throne. The hawkish Zaganos Pasha pressed for one great assault, trusting numbers to do what cannon could not. But with no practicable breach and the season closing, Halil's case carried the divan. Mehmed, calculating like the survivor he would prove to be, chose to bank a certain gain over a possible catastrophe. He lifted the siege in exchange for a crushing tribute, frontier concessions, and the renewed acknowledgement of Ottoman supremacy. He withdrew with his honor intact and his power whole. He told himself the city would keep. Constantine Alintha Palaiologos remained what he had been, the last reigning emperor of the Romans, ruler now of a poor, shrunken, and intact state. The empire was barely more than its capital and a few scattered holdings, but it had survived, and survival was itself an argument. For a century, the Christian powers of the Balkans had treated Ottoman advance as a tide that could be slowed but never reversed. Now the tide had stopped at a cracked gun barrel and a Grand Vizier's cold counsel. In Buda and Venice, in the Serbian and the Albanian lands, the lesson registered slowly and then sharply. The Sultan was not invincible. Walls and patience and a little luck could hold him. Hunyadi's prestige rose without his ever striking a blow, and the rumor of relief that had helped end the siege became, in the retelling, something nearer a fact. The reprieve did not make Byzantium strong. It made the men around Byzantium braver, and that, for now, was enough to keep the frontier from collapsing inward. There was no sack, no 3 days of plunder, no burning of the libraries, no scholars stuffing manuscripts into saddlebags for the long road to Italy. And so the men who carried the living memory of the ancient world stayed where they were. The teachers of Greek, the copyists, the readers of Plato and Aristotle in the original tongue, they kept their chairs, their pupils, and their shelves. Constantinople remained what it had been for 1,000 years, a working center of classical learning, not a relic mourned from a distance. In the history that did not happen here, those refugees flooded west and lit the Greek revival of the Italian Renaissance like a struck match. In this timeline, the fire is slower and it has 2 hearths. The knowledge does not arrive all at once as a tragedy's inheritance. It moves as trade moves, book by book, student by student, across a sea that still has a Greek-speaking capital at its eastern end. The exchange is longer. It is also less broken. The reprieve had a price the Pope had not foreseen. The Union of Florence of 1439, which had bound the Orthodox Church to Rome in exchange for the promise of Western aid, had always been hated in the streets of Constantinople. Many there had said openly that they would sooner see the Sultan's turban in the city than the cardinal's hat. Now the Sultan had come and gone, and the city still stood, and the bitter logic seemed vindicated. Rome's help had never been what saved them. Lucas Notaras, the Megas do and leader of the anti-union party, gave that feeling its voice. With the threat of conquest lifted, the pressure to keep faith with the Latins fell away. The union was quietly repudiated. The surviving empire turned instead toward the deep well of Orthodox solidarity, toward the Slavic principalities, toward the rising power of Moscow, toward the Balkan churches that looked to Constantinople as their mother. The empire was weak, but it remained the spiritual capital of an entire world, and it chose that world over the West that had asked so much and delivered so little. Mehmed II was not a man to brood over one denial. Checked on the Bosphorus, he turned the immense energy of his state in the directions where it could still win. He pressed into Anatolia, swallowing the rival Turkish emirates that had never fully bowed. He reached for the Black Sea coast and its grain and its trade, and into the Aegean, island by island. His empire grew wide and rich in the east, even as it stalled in the west. The European frontier, denied its keystone, hardened into something it had never quite been before, a guarded border rather than an open road. Garrisons replaced campaigns. The drive that history remembers as relentless became, in this timeline, a thing that could be contained because once, when it mattered most, it had been. And then came the choice that would define the shape of the whole Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Not whether the empire would be reborn in glory, but whether it could survive at all on terms it did not control. It survived by trading independence for breath. The Rump Empire was too poor to defend itself and too valuable to be left alone, and it learned to live in that narrow space. It paid the Sultan his tribute. It leased the use of its straits to the merchants of Genoa and Venice, who wanted the passage to the Black Sea more than they wanted any crusade. It played the Ottoman against the Hungarian against the Venetian, never strong enough to defy any of them, always useful enough to be kept alive by all of them. This was not a golden age. An emperor still reigned in the city of Constantine, and the liturgy still rose under the dome of the Hagia Sophia, but the empire's freedom was a fiction maintained by other men's rivalries. Its survival was a negotiated thing, renewed each year, dependent on the balance never tipping. The Romans endured. They endured as a client and a crossroads, holding the most coveted strip of water in the world precisely because no single power could be allowed to seize it. So the rebirth of classical learning came along two linked lines instead of one. There was the Latin West, with its workshops and its patrons and its hunger for the ancient texts. And there was a living Greek East, still teaching in the old tongue, still copying and arguing in the city where the manuscripts had survived 1,000 years. The Mediterranean carried the exchange between them as it carried everything else gradually, commercially, without the violent severance that an Ottoman capital at Constantinople would have driven into the heart of the Christian East. The difference is not that this world is better, it is that the break never comes. There is no single catastrophic year that ends the Roman name forever, no flood of exiles, no sudden silence where a civilization had been. Instead, there is a long, uneven, negotiated continuity, full of compromise and dependence and unglamorous survival. A cracked gun barrel did not save an empire's greatness. It only let an old, tired, stubborn state go on existing, and that small mercy, extended across centuries, was enough to give the world a slower fall, a quieter inheritance, and a memory that never had to be carried away in a refugee's hands.